So the theme of this video is about miscarriages of justice in the United Kingdom. I'm absolutely not going to cover every high-profile case in this one video, but there's a recent case involving a man called Oliver Campbell, which I'm going to talk about. Before I get into that, though, there's another case that hasn't yet been proven to be a miscarriage of justice. Certainly, a lot of questions around it, and it's a very high-profile case. I'm talking about Lucy Letby. My last video on this, and it's the second video I've made on the subject. I've got over 500 views and about 40 comments. So apologies if I don't get back to all the comments, but I did sort of browse through them, and there seems to be a consensus that there is a lot of people out there who do believe now that are serious doubts on her guilt. There's still those who say that actually it was the correct decision, and the campaigners for her are missing out key points about this, but um, aside from the fact there's been other high profile miscarriages of justice, particularly in the medical profession, um, one of the things that's emerged recently is that um, within the wards, apparently there was different sentiments going on depending on different staff. So, for example, junior doctors didn't trust Letby, and yet many of her other colleagues did. And there was actually some sort of disciplinary hearings going on regarding purported bullying, whether that was towards Letby or whether Letby was doing that. I don't know. All I'll say about that case is that none of us can be absolutely sure. But I don't agree with this idea that raising questions about it is insulting the families of the babies, because this isn't the same as saying she's guilty or she should get a lesser sentence, because she's a woman or something like that. This is about questioning the very fact if she is guilty or not. Now, I have enormous sympathy for those families. It must be an awful thing to have your little baby die and told that a serial killer done it. But if Letby is innocent, then those families are being deprived of justice as well. Surely they have a right to know the truth. So I know it will be painful for them to have another trial open up. I know that is it's far from ideal for the families, but if a potentially innocent woman is in prison, then it has to be that way. Um, I mean, basically, Lucy Letby shouldn't be sacrificed for potentially something else that is going on. And that's not the same as saying she is definitely innocent. I'm not saying she is innocent. I'm just saying that there is a lot of question marks on this case. If she is guilty, she is where she belongs, and I think she should spend the rest of her life behind bars, because she would be, by definition, a serial killer. But I just think there is significant doubts on this case. Now, the case I'm going to be talking about, it hasn't yet been called a miscarriage of justice de facto, but I'm sure this name is going to be added. If you look at Wikipedia, there's a list going back to the 30s of numerous high profile miscarriages of justice in this country. Off the top of my head, I can talk about Andrew Malkinson, who spent 17 years in prison for a rape that he did not commit. And only last year was he freed, and Greater Manchester Police made a prolonged apology. I mean, a long overdue apology. This man had 17 years of his life taken away for something he did not do, for a serious crime. And the case I'm going to read out, again, serious crime, and a man who has just had his conviction quashed. So this is a BBC report. It's by Tom Arthur. Tom MacArthur. I am going to read out the whole thing because it's important. Um, this could open the door for many other cases, and I've long felt that where there are miscarriages of justice, more often than not, it is based on so-called confessions. In fact, we had a case in Sunderland, 1992, an awful crime. A little girl by the name of Nikki Allen was brutally murdered. It was a horrendous case. I mean, all child murders are, but the circumstances of that were particularly grim. And the man who was initially arrested for it supposedly confessed. Um, there was a lot of pressure on the police at the time. A child had been murdered. There were high pressures to make an arrest. The man who actually done it confessed last year and got a whole life tariff. Effectively, the man who was innocent, he didn't do extensive prison time, but his life was destroyed. He had to relocate death threats, etc. So, a miscarriage of justice is a terrible thing. And I think it's a travesty that the legal system, until very recently, were actually deducting money from compensation for bed and board. This is adding insult to injury. Some of the tabloids wouldn't even take up those sort of cases because they say, oh, we don't speak up for criminals. But the point is, if someone is found innocent, then they're not, by definition, guilty of that crime. So, anyway, without further ado, I'm going to read this out. A man with learning disabilities who says he felt under pressure to confess to a murder says he has not had a life for the last 33 years. Three judges ruled that Oliver Campbell's 1991 conviction for the murder of Baldiv Hundal in East London the previous year was unsafe. I could have had a full-time job, been in a relationship, had kids, been on holiday. I couldn't do that yesterday, but now I can and plan the rest of my life, he told the BBC. Bear in mind, this is a middle-aged man now. And before I continue this, sorry, I should say there was a similar case in Texas. A man spent over 30 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. The judge made an apology recently, and the first thing the guy said was actually to speak out for his victim and hope his victim, or not his victim, the victim in the case got justice. His purported confession, this is an Oliver Campbell case, at the time was made up amid the stress of being badgered and bullied during interviews judges had previously heard. He said he believed part of the reason why he was jailed was that he was being treated as a scapegoat and said, I didn't put myself in prison, it's the system that put me there. Speaking to the BBC, he added that despite his time in prison, he had not lost faith in the justice system and had never considered ending his fight against his conviction. Well, I think a lot of people could excuse him if he had lost faith in it. I certainly would. The weight is off my shoulders, but the thing is, there's still someone who committed a crime out there. That's all I've got to say, he said. This is like the Texas case. One of his first considerations is for the victim's family and the fact that the real killer is out there. Um, the Crown Prosecution Service, which opposed the bid, said they respected the judgment of the court. Court of Appeal rejected 17 grounds of appeal, and these convictions were only quashed on the basis of new evidence providing more information about Oliver Campbell's mental state when he confessed to murder, a spokesman said. Among the grounds of appeal rejected was a claim of serious allegations of manipulation, deliberate misleading bullying made against police officers. Why was it rejected? I mean, is that a bias to the courts towards the police? In the ruling, Lord Justice Holroyd, sitting with Mr. Justice Bourne and Mrs. Justice Stacey, said the court could not be sure how a jury would have considered new evidence of mental capacity, and on that narrow but very important basis, we have concluded that convictions are unsafe. Given Mr. Campbell had already spent more than a decade in prison, more than 2 decades on licence, he could not have a fair trial when he would be unable to process the information. Mr. Campbell was jailed for life in 1991 over the murder of Mr. Hundal, who was shot dead during a botched robbery in Hackney carried out by two men. His lawyers and supporters say his confession at the time mirrored what he had watched on BBC's Crime Watch. Mr. Campbell was released on a life licence in 2002 and lived in Suffolk with the assistance of a close group of friends and helpers. His supporters added, we are all in tears, all his life starts now. Campbell suffered a brain injury when he was a baby. Experts say the injury has badly affected his memory and general ability to process more than basic information, leaving him suggestible and vulnerable to potential manipulation. This is extremely important stuff that absolutely should have been considered in the initial trial. His barrister, Michael Birnbaum KC, told the court earlier this year that there were ample grounds to find his conviction unsafe, suggesting he was badgered and bullied by police into giving a false confession over his involvement. Mr. Birnbaum said that his client's learning disabilities meant he made confessions which were simply absurd and nonsense and contained a litany of inconsistencies against the facts of the case. Lord Justice Holroyd said in the ruling, we accept that considered in the light of fresh evidence, the rulings might be different. He continued, a jury knowing of the fresh evidence would be considering the reliability of these confessions in a materially different context. In those circumstances, we cannot say that the fresh evidence could not reasonably affect the decision of the jury to convict. The judge said that the decision would be a heavy blow to the family of Mr. Hoodle, but he trusted that they will understand that we must reach our decisions in accordance with the law, uninfluenced by emotion. Officers will continue to support Mr. Hundel's family, a Metropolitan Police spokesperson added. I mean, this is the thing the victim's family deserve the real culprit to be identified. The murder of Baldev Singh Hundal in July 1990 was fully investigated by detectives at the time, with a range of evidence brought before a jury who convicted the defendant in the following year, they also said. After Mr. Campbell was arrested in late 1990, he was interviewed 14 times by detectives as they sought to build a case to prove the then 19-year-old had pulled the trigger. Officers at Hackney Police Station recognised that Mr. Campbell had learning difficulties, and for the first 10 interviews, local social services had provided an adult to assist him. His lawyers believe the purported confession may have therefore been inspired by what he had remembered seeing on the TV as he tried to end the repeated questioning. So the police did actually have, that's an angle to the case, they did actually have um, someone with him at the time, but that person either didn't do the job or didn't question that. Speaking to BBC News in 2021, Mr. Campbell said the trauma of his conviction had destroyed his life and he had lost contact with most of his friends and family. It's discussing what happened to me, he told the programme. That's all I've got to say. It's discussing how different people out there got away with what they've done to me in my life in 1991. Mr. Campbell added, I'm an innocent person in the justice system and in the prison system. The justice system put me there. The quashing of the conviction comes 20 years after the Criminal Cases Review Commission, the miscarriages of justice body, rejected his pleas for help, and after two inquiries were triggered into how it handled the case of Andy Malkinson, that's the other case I mentioned, who was cleared of rape after a 20-year campaign. A spokesperson for the CCRC said it referred Mr. Campbell's case in 2022, having declined to do so in 2005, in light of new evidence that his vulnerability had not been properly understood or explained at trial. The commission's review involved speaking again to an expert used at the original trial, as well as a second expert who explained how a modern approach to assessing Mr. Campbell would take a more holistic view considered his background and experience. The Court of Appeal judgment makes clear that its decision is based on fresh evidence from recent research work, and that the undertaking of the factors which may contribute to a false profession had increased, the CCRC said. It also states that there have been important developments in the law relating to admissibility of evidence and in matters of practice and procedure relevant to their trial. So, a lot of information. I felt it was important to read it all out. This is 1990 we're talking about. It's not the Dark Ages. Um, it's troubling to consider how many other cases out there might be unsafe. Um, I think there is too much emphasis put on alleged confessions, and I do think that the techniques that the police use need to come under some scrutiny, because there's been too many cases where you've had people confessing after being just worn down, particularly mentally vulnerable people, worn down by the police. I do think that the police are under pressure. They want to get an arrest, they want to push a case forward. So I do think they're capable of wearing someone down and coercing that person into a confession. I mean, it's easy to say an innocent person should never confess, but if someone's mentally fragile and they're being told over and over again, "Did you do it? Did you do it? Were you there?" You know, badgering them constantly instead of looking at it in an objective way. I mean, I do think the police, in some cases, I'm not saying across the board, but in some cases, they're just looking for a confession. Um, I don't entirely trust the police in that regard because they have been complicit in miscarriages of justice, and this is a sinister thing. I think, I mean, it's awful that dangerous criminals get away with crimes, and it's awful when you get a very serious crime resulting in a lenient sentence. But it's also awful that you get miscarriages of justice. Um, I also wonder, does the legal establishment give too much weight into kind of patting each other's backs? What I mean by that is the Court of Appeal, it seems too often they will just go along with the original verdict because, well, a judge made that verdict. So we'll go along with the judge. We're not going to second guess the judge, even though new evidence is emerging. I do think there is a degree of establishment. I'm not going to say corruption because that's an explicit action, it's an explicit culture. But I do think there is a sort of arrogant, we know best attitude there. I say that because there are many cases where original evidence just gets ignored. Excuse me, evidence gets ignored, where defense lawyers don't have the same sort of balance as prosecution lawyers. Now, we have to be careful not to get in the situation where every single case says, oh, maybe they're innocent, maybe they're innocent. The majority of people in prison are guilty, but there is just too many cases like this happening. So it does bring about questions as to how police conduct questioning, as to how mental health is assessed in interviews. I mean, the report says that he had an appropriate adult with him, but what sort of capacity did that person have? I mean, it's better than nothing, but when he confessed, why did that person not sort of intervene and say, look, are you sure you know what you're saying here? Um, it's troubling. And the other thing about a miscarriage of justice, it's not an anti-victim position to say that those who have suffered a miscarriage of justice should be released and get compensation and be able to rebuild their lives. If anything, it's just as much in the interest of the victim to know the truth and to have the real killer behind bars. So in this case, as with the case in Texas, um, the first thing, or one of the first things the man had said is, you know, he hopes that the real killer will be caught, not verbatim, but that's what he has suggested. I mean, it would be awful for the victim's family to think the guy that's been in prison for all its time and being on release, oh, well, he's actually innocent. That would be a huge blow to them. And they will need specialist support. That would be awful for them because if they have managed to rebuild their life in any way, then that's all shattered now. So I do have huge sympathy for victims. It's like the Central Park Five. A lot's made of the fact that it was an awful miscarriage of justice. There was racism involved and so on. But it shouldn't be forgotten a young woman was raped in that case. She shouldn't be overlooked either. So that's the thing in miscarriages of justice. Victims shouldn't be ignored either. You have a victim in the sense of an innocent person in prison, but you also have the original victim of the crime, and they shouldn't be forgotten. Um, so I'll put a link to this case, what I've just been reading out from the BBC. But clearly, the justice system, when you have high profile crimes, i.e., of very serious crimes like murder or rape, every single angle needs to be looked at. And I do have question marks if judges dismiss evidence. No evidence, no credible evidence should be dismissed. I'm not talking about conspiracy theories on the internet. I'm talking about evidence that could be mitigating or aggravating. I think too often it is ignored. There's too many cases that raise question marks. So let me know your thoughts on this one. I hope Mr. Campbell can rebuild his life. I mean, how do you? When you're a middle-aged man, it's just, I just hope he can. I hope he can find some happiness because, my goodness, he deserves it. Um, as does Andy Malcolmson and everyone else in this country. I mean, the most obvious case that I haven't even mentioned yet, the postmasters. That's an industrial scale miscarriage of justice. All of this stuff together, people shouldn't be so quick to dismiss the Lucy Letby case as, not being valid for questions because I think there is questions there. One last point, I wouldn't want to see guilty people let out of prison on a technicality because they might actually be guilty. But I just think where you have cases where there is significant doubt on a conviction, then justice has to prevail and there has to be a retrial.